The morning sun cast long shadows across James Henderson's well-kept lawn as he slowly rocked in his favorite wooden chair on the front porch. At 93, his movements were careful and deliberate, but his mind remained sharp as the spring breeze that rustled through his silver hair. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and old scars, rested gently on his worn blue jeans as he watched the neighborhood come to life. James had lived in this modest two-story house on Maple Street for over 5 decades. The white paint might have faded slightly, and the green shutters needed a fresh coat, but to him, every crack and creak held precious memories. It was the home where he and his beloved wife Margaret had raised their 3 children, celebrated countless birthdays, and shared quiet evenings watching the sunset. Every morning followed the same peaceful routine he had maintained since Margaret's passing 2 years ago. He would wake at 6 a.m., brew a pot of coffee using the same old percolator they had bought in 1975, and enjoy his first cup while watching the sunrise from his kitchen window. The familiar routine helped fill the emptiness that Margaret's absence had left behind. By 7 a.m., James would be in his garden, a beautiful space that had become his pride and joy. Rows of vegetables grew in neat lines, tomatoes, cucumbers, and green beans that he shared with his neighbors. But the true treasures were Margaret's roses, which he tended with extra care, making sure they bloomed as beautifully as when she was alive. The red and pink blossoms reminded him of her bright smile and the gentle way she used to care for them. The neighborhood children often stopped by during their walk to school. They found something fascinating about the old veteran who always had interesting stories and butterscotch candies in his pockets. 10-year-old Tommy from next door was a regular visitor, sitting cross-legged on the porch steps as James shared carefully edited stories from his time in World War II. The boy's eyes would grow wide with wonder as James described the friendships he had formed, the countries he had seen, and the importance of standing up for what was right. In the afternoons, James would settle into his routine of reading. His living room bookshelf held an impressive collection of history books and military memoirs, but lately he had developed a fondness for mystery novels. The local librarian, Miss Peters, would bring him new books every 2 weeks, knowing his preference for stories with happy endings. She would often stay for a cup of tea, listening patiently as he shared memories of Margaret and their life together. James kept his house in perfect order, just as Margaret had always done. Every Sunday, he dusted the family photos that lined the hallway walls, their wedding day in 1948, family picnics, graduations, and the birth of their grandchildren. Their youngest grandson, Mike, visited every weekend to help with the heavier household chores, but James insisted on doing most things himself. "Keeping busy keeps me young," you would say with a twinkle in his faded blue eyes. The neighbors all knew James as the kind-hearted veteran who never missed sending a card on birthdays or bringing soup when someone was sick. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street often brought him homemade tamales, worried that he wasn't eating enough. In return, he shared his garden vegetables and stories about Margaret's secret recipes. Despite living alone, James never felt lonely during these peaceful days. His military training had taught him the importance of structure and purpose, and he filled his days with small but meaningful activities. He wrote letters to old war buddies, worked on his memoir for his grandchildren, and kept a daily journal just as he had done during the war. As each day drew to a close, James would sit on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. He would think about Margaret, about their life together, and feel grateful for the quiet happiness he had found in his golden years. The sound of children playing, the smell of blooming flowers, and the gentle rhythm of neighborhood life were all he needed. Little did James know that his peaceful routine was about to face an unexpected challenge, one that would test his patience, wisdom, and ability to understand others in ways he never imagined. But for now, he was content in his quiet life, surrounded by memories of love and the simple pleasures of each new day. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in May. James was trimming his rose bushes when the peaceful neighborhood air was suddenly filled with the roar of motorcycle engines. At first, he thought they were just passing through, but the noise grew louder as 5 motorcycles turned into the empty lot next to his house. The empty lot had been vacant since the old Wilson house burned down 2 years ago. The city had cleared the charred remains but never approved new construction, leaving behind a flat, grass-covered space that neighborhood kids sometimes used for playing catch. Now, leather-clad figures astride gleaming motorcycles circled the lot, their engines echoing off nearby houses. James watched as the bikers dismounted their machines. Their leader, A tall man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos took off his helmet and lit a cigarette. His leather vest displayed patches James didn't recognize, but the way the others deferred to him made his authority clear. They set up folding chairs and pulled out beer cans from their saddlebags, making themselves at home. The noise was unlike anything the neighborhood had experienced before. Mrs. Rodriguez's cat darted under her porch, and Tommy's mother quickly called him inside when he stopped to stare at the newcomers. The peaceful afternoon James had planned for reading his new mystery novel seemed impossible now, with the constant revving of engines and loud laughter floating through his windows. After an hour of trying to ignore the disturbance, James decided to approach them. He walked carefully across his lawn, using his cane more for stability than usual. His military training had taught him to face challenges directly, but also diplomatically. As he approached, the conversation among the bikers quieted, and several pairs of eyes turned to watch him. "Good afternoon," James said politely, his voice clear despite his age. "I'm James Henderson, and I live right next door. I was wondering if you might consider keeping the noise down a bit. Many of us here are retired, and we're used to a quiet neighborhood." The bearded leader took a long look at James, blowing cigarette smoke into the air. "Public property, old man," he said, his voice gruff. "We got as much right to be here as anyone." This brought chuckles from his companions, who seemed amused by James's request. Over the next few days, the bikers made the lot their regular meeting place. They would arrive in the afternoon, sometimes in groups of 5, other times bringing 10 or more motorcycles. They brought coolers full of beer, played loud music from portable speakers, and left tire tracks across the grass. Empty cans and cigarette butts began to litter the ground, sometimes blowing into James's carefully maintained yard. The neighborhood's character changed quickly. Parents no longer let their children play outside when the bikers were present. The evening walks that elderly couples used to enjoy became rare. Even the mail carrier seemed to hurry more than usual when delivering to houses near the lot. James tried calling the police twice. The first time, an officer drove by slowly but didn't stop. The second time, 2 officers came to talk to the bikers, but since they weren't technically trespassing and no laws were being broken, nothing changed. The police suggested that the residents could file noise complaints, but warned that such complaints rarely led to any real action. The situation grew more tense when James noticed some of the bikers watching his house, especially when his grandson Mike visited. Their stares seemed challenging, almost threatening. One afternoon, he overheard them laughing about teaching the old-timer to mind his own business. The final straw came when James found his mailbox knocked over one morning. Though he hadn't seen who did it, the tire tracks in his grass told the story. As he stood there looking at the damaged mailbox, the first motorcycles of the day roared into the lot. The leader, whom James had heard the others call Razor, smiled mockingly and waved. That evening, as James sat in his living room, surrounded by the rumbling of motorcycles and loud music from next door, he realized that his peaceful life had been completely disrupted. The photos of Margaret on the walls seemed to vibrate with each rev of an engine. His hands, which had steadily guided troops through war zones, now trembled slightly as he held his evening cup of tea. But James Henderson hadn't survived World War II and 93 years of life by giving up easily. As he watched the bikers through his window, a plan began to form in his mind. If they thought his age made him an easy target, they were about to learn an important lesson about underestimating a veteran. The summer heat seemed to make everyone's tempers flare, and the situation with the bikers grew worse with each passing day. Razor and his gang had claimed the empty lot as their territory, marking it with their presence from early afternoon until well past sunset. Their numbers had grown too, sometimes swelling to 15 or 20 motorcycles crowding the space. James noticed how they would deliberately rev their engines whenever he stepped onto his porch. If he was working in his garden, they would inch their bikes closer to his property line, the exhaust fumes wilting his precious plants. When he tried to read his morning paper outside, their raucous laughter and crude jokes would float across the lawn, just loud enough to make sure he heard every word. The second time his mailbox was knocked over, James found a crude note attached to it. "Too bad about your mail, Gramps," it read. He recognized the handwriting matched the style of tattoos on Razor's arms. The local police officer, Officer Thompson, came by to take photos, but his expression told James what he already knew. There wasn't enough evidence to do anything about it. "Look, Mr. Henderson," Officer Thompson said quietly, glancing at the bikers who were watching from the lot. These guys are known troublemakers, but they're careful. They know exactly how far they can push without crossing any serious legal lines. The best advice I can give you is to avoid engaging with them. But avoiding them became impossible when they started targeting his garden. One morning, James discovered motorcycle tracks cutting through his vegetable patch, crushing the tomato plants he had carefully tended since spring. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had witnessed it from her window the night before, was too frightened to provide a formal statement to the police. "I'm so sorry, Senor James," she whispered, bringing him a plate of homemade empanadas to comfort him. "They saw me watching through my window, and one of them pointed at my house. I have my grandchildren living with me. I cannot risk their safety." The neighborhood watch meeting, held in the community center, drew a larger crowd than usual. Everyone had stories to share about the bikers: noise complaints, intimidation, littering, and property damage. But when it came time to take action, fear kept most hands down. The bikers had created an atmosphere of intimidation that affected the entire street. James's grandson Mike wanted to confront the gang directly. "You can't let them treat you like this, Grandpa," he insisted during his weekend visit. "Let me talk to them. I took some self-defense classes and I—" "No." James cut him off firmly, his old commanding officer voice emerging. "That's exactly what they want. An excuse for violence. We're not going to give them that satisfaction." But later that night, alone in his kitchen, James's hands shook as he made his evening tea, remembering how young men's bravado could lead to tragedy. He'd seen enough of that in the war. The situation reached a breaking point on a Sunday afternoon. James was hosting his weekly tea with Miss Peters, the librarian, when the bikers decided to put on what they called a show. They circled the lot repeatedly, engines roaring, performing dangerous stunts that sent dust and rocks flying toward James's property. Miss Peters left early, visibly shaken by the display. That evening, as James watered what remained of his garden, Razor approached the property line. The biker's leather vest gleamed in the setting sun, his beard now streaked with gray that made him look more menacing than distinguished. "Having trouble with your flowers, old-timer?" Razor called out, his voice carrying a mock concern that made his followers laugh. "Shame if anything happened to those pretty roses, especially since they're all you got left of the missus, right?" The mention of Margaret's roses sent a chill through James's spine. He never told them about Margaret or her roses. They must have been watching, listening, gathering information about him. The casual threat against his late wife's beloved flowers struck deeper than any physical intimidation. That night, James sat in his darkened living room, watching the bikers through his window. The shadows moved across his wall like specters, their laughter echoing in the evening air. The framed photo of him and Margaret on their 50th anniversary seemed to glow softly in the darkness. Her smile, forever captured in that moment, reminded him of something important. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting, but from outsmarting your opponent. As he watched Razor and his gang, James's military training kicked in. Every opponent had a weakness. Every bully had a vulnerable spot. He just needed to find it. And after weeks of observing them, he was beginning to see patterns, behaviors, and details that others might miss. It was time to put his combat strategy training to use, not with weapons or violence, but with something far more powerful: intelligence. The morning started like any other, with James making his way to check on Margaret's roses at sunrise. He had managed to protect them so far, despite the bikers' various acts of vandalism. The roses were more than just plants to him. They were his last living connection to Margaret, each bloom carefully bred and tended by her hands over decades. The sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. His weathered hand gripped his cane tighter as he surveyed the destruction before him. The rose garden, Margaret's pride and joy for 40 years, lay in ruins. Tire tracks cut deep through the flower beds, roses crushed and scattered across the lawn. The wooden trellises Margaret had painted white every spring were splintered and broken, their pieces strewn across the decimated garden. James slowly lowered himself to his knees, ignoring the pain in his joints. His trembling fingers touched a crushed pink rose, Margaret's favorite variety. She had called them her sunrise roses because their color matched the dawn sky. Now they were ground into the mud, their sweet scent mixed with the acrid smell of motorcycle exhaust. Mrs. Rodriguez found him there an hour later, still kneeling in the ruined garden. She helped him inside and made him tea, her own eyes filling with tears as she watched this proud veteran struggle to compose himself. "Senor James," she said softly, "my Carlos is a lawyer. Perhaps he can help." But James barely heard her. His mind was somewhere else, back in 1944 during the war. He had been a young lieutenant then, facing a seemingly impossible situation with his unit pinned down behind enemy lines. They had survived not through brute force, but through careful observation, strategic thinking, and using their enemies' assumptions against them. The sound of motorcycles roaring into the lot next door snapped him back to the present. He could hear Razor's distinctive laugh, followed by comments about teaching the old man a lesson. They were celebrating their victory, confident that they had broken his spirit. James stood up slowly, his military bearing returning despite his age. Mrs. Rodriguez watched with concern as he walked to his study, pulled out an old leather briefcase, and removed a small notebook, the same type he had used for mission planning during the war. His hands were steady now, his eyes clear and focused. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said quietly, "would you be kind enough to call my grandson Mike? And perhaps ask your son Carlos to stop by when he has a moment." There was something in his voice that made her straighten up, a tone of command that had never quite left him since his military days. As he waited for Mike to arrive, James began to write in his notebook. He listed everything he knew about the bikers, their arrival times, their patterns, the hierarchy within their group. He noted how Razor always parked in the same spot, how the newer members tried to prove themselves with increasingly reckless behavior, how they seemed to time their worst activities for when police patrols were least likely. His grandson arrived within an hour, out of breath and angry about the roses. "Grandpa, we have to do something. We can't let them." "We're going to do something," James interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "But not what they expect. Not what anyone expects." He pulled out his old military maps from the war, spreading them on the table. They were yellowed with age, marked with strategic notations from battles long past. In war, he explained to Mike, the biggest mistake you can make is underestimating your opponent. But the second biggest mistake is letting your opponent know your true strength. He pointed to his notebook, then to the military maps. "I've been watching them, learning their patterns, just like we did with enemy units. Now it's time to use that information." Mike looked confused. "But Grandpa, this isn't war, and you're—" "I'm a 93-year-old man who they think they can bully," James finished for him. "And that's exactly what we're going to use against them." His eyes had a spark that Mike hadn't seen before, reminding him of the stories his grandmother used to tell about James's strategic brilliance during the war. As the day drew to a close, James sat at his desk, finalizing his plan. Through his window, he could see the bikers in the lot, their arrogant laughter carrying through the evening air. They thought they had won by destroying Margaret's roses. They didn't realize they had just made their biggest mistake. They had given a military strategist nothing left to lose. In his lifetime, James had learned that true strength often lay in wisdom rather than force. As he looked at the old photo of himself in uniform, then at Margaret's smiling face on their wedding day, he knew exactly what needed to be done. The bikers had no idea that their act of destruction had just set in motion a plan that would change everything. The next morning, instead of his usual routine, James sat at his kitchen table with Mike and Carlos Rodriguez, Mrs. Rodriguez's lawyer's son. Spread before them were documents, maps, and James's notebook filled with detailed observations. Mike had brought his laptop and several small cameras, while Carlos reviewed city ordinances and property laws. "Everything they do follows a pattern," James explained, pointing to his careful notes. "Razor arrives first, usually at 2 p.m. The others follow within 30 minutes. They leave evidence everywhere, but no one's been documenting it properly." His military training had taught him that information was often the most powerful weapon. Mike began setting up small, hidden cameras around James's property. He positioned them carefully, one near the damaged rose garden, another with a clear view of the lot, and several more covering different angles. "These are motion-activated, Grandpa," he explained. "They'll record everything and save it to the cloud automatically." Carlos nodded approvingly as he reviewed James's notebook. "This is exactly what we need," he said, examining the detailed timestamps and descriptions. "You've documented every incident, every threat, every act of vandalism. Most people get emotional and forget to keep records, but you've treated this like a military operation." James smiled slightly. In the war, we learned that the best victories often come from careful planning rather than direct confrontation. He pulled out an old map from his military days, using it to explain tactical surveillance. We're going to let them think they've won while we gather intelligence. Over the next week, James maintained his usual schedule but with supple changes. He appeared to stay inside more, letting the bikers think they had successfully intimidated him. Meanwhile, the cameras captured everything: the noise violations, the property damage, the threatening behavior. Carlos helped him file official complaints with proper documentation, building a solid legal case. But James's strategy went deeper than just collecting evidence. He began researching the bikers themselves, using public records and online databases that Mike helped him access. Every night, he added to his notebook license plate numbers, club affiliations, patterns of behavior. He noticed how some members seemed uncomfortable with the escalating harassment, how others appeared to be following Razor's lead out of fear rather than loyalty. "Look here," James pointed out to Mike one evening, showing him surveillance footage. "See how that younger member, the one with the red bandana, hesitates before participating in their more aggressive actions. And notice how Razor always positions himself where he can be seen by the others, like a commander maintaining control." The strategy evolved beyond just documentation. James worked with Carlos to contact city officials about zoning violations in the empty lot. They discovered that the lot wasn't properly designated for public gathering, and the soil needed to be tested for contamination from the old house fire. This information could be valuable leverage. Mrs. Rodriguez and other neighbors, encouraged by James's methodical approach, began contributing their own observations. They created a neighborhood watch group that documented incidents without confrontation, following James's military-style protocols for gathering intelligence. In war, James explained to the neighbors during a quiet meeting in his living room, the enemy's greatest weakness is often their own overconfidence. He showed them how to record incidents safely, how to gather evidence without putting themselves at risk. The community began working together like a well-organized unit, just as James had led in his military days. One particular discovery proved especially interesting. While reviewing some footage, Mike noticed something about Razor's vest. "Grandpa, look at these patches," he said, zooming in on the image. "Some of these are military unit insignias." James studied the image carefully, his experienced eyes picking out details others might miss. The realization hit him with unexpected force. These weren't just random troublemakers. Some of them, including Razor, had military backgrounds. This information changed everything. As the sun set on another day of surveillance, James sat in his study reviewing their collected intelligence. The walls were now covered with photos, maps, and documented incidents, resembling the command centers he worked in during the war. But this time, his goal wasn't to defeat an enemy. It was to find a solution that no one expected. Looking at the photo of Razor's military patches, James felt a plan forming. His years of military experience had taught him that sometimes the best strategy isn't to destroy your opponent, but to understand them. With all the intelligence they had gathered, he now saw a possibility that none of the bikers would expect from a 93-year-old veteran they thought they had defeated. James sat at his computer with Mike, carefully reviewing the public records they had gathered about the bikers. What they discovered changed everything. Razor, whose real name was Robert Bobby Martinez, had served 2 tours in Vietnam. 3 other gang members were veterans of Desert Storm, and 2 more had served in Iraq. "Look at this," Grandpa Mike said, pointing to a news article from 15 years ago. The photograph showed a younger Razor receiving a Purple Heart. He stood straight and proud in his military uniform, clean-shaven, with short hair and clear eyes. The contrast between that image and the intimidating biker was striking. James leaned closer to the screen, recognition dawning in his eyes. The signs had been there all along: the way Razor organized his group, the military precision in their formation when they rode, even their choice of territory and defensive positions. These weren't just random troublemakers. They were trained soldiers who had lost their way. Further research revealed more. Razor had struggled with PTSD after Vietnam, like many veterans of that war. The VA hospital records showed a pattern familiar to James: nightmares, anxiety, difficulty adjusting to civilian life. The motorcycle club had started as a support group for veterans, but somewhere along the way, it had turned into something else. I know that look in their eyes, James said quietly, studying recent photos Mike had captured. I've seen it before, in men who came back from war. The world feels too quiet, too normal. Sometimes it's easier to create chaos than to deal with the silence. James pulled out his own military photos, yellowed with age. One showed him shortly after returning from World War II, standing alone at a train station. His uniform was pristine, but his eyes held the same distant look he now recognized in Razor's group. Another photo showed him 6 months later, disheveled and angry, during what Margaret had later called his dark period. Your grandmother saved me, James explained to Mike, touching the photo gently. She understood that I needed time to find my way back, but she never gave up on me, even when I was at my worst. He looked out his window at the empty lot where the bikers gathered. These men never had their Margaret. The next photo in the stack showed James with his old therapy group from 1947. They had met in a church basement, all of them struggling with what they'd seen in the war. We helped each other heal, James said. Sometimes you need someone who understands the nightmares without you having to explain them. As evening approached, James heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles. But now, watching Razor and his group through the window, he saw them differently. He noticed how they positioned themselves to watch all approaches to the lot, a military defensive formation. How they communicated with hand signals similar to those used in combat. How they stayed close together, watching each other's backs like soldiers in hostile territory. They're not bullies, James said, his voice firm. They're lost soldiers trying to fight a war that ended years ago. He remembered his own struggles, the anger that had threatened to consume him until Margaret and his therapy group helped him find his way back to peace. Looking through more records, they found that most of the younger members in the group were sons of veterans, seeking the structure and purpose their fathers had found in military service. Some had criminal records, but mostly for minor offenses, noise violations, disturbing the peace, the kind of trouble that spoke more of restlessness than true malice. James pulled out his notebook where he'd been documenting their activities. With this new understanding, he began to see patterns he'd missed before. The escalation in their behavior usually happened around significant dates: Veterans Day, Memorial Day, the anniversaries of major battles in Vietnam and Iraq. Mike, James said, closing the notebook, I think we've been looking at this all wrong. We're not dealing with an enemy force. We're dealing with wounded soldiers who've lost their way home. He looked at the ruined rose garden through his window, but instead of anger, he felt something different: understanding. The sun was setting as James formulated a new plan. All his military training, all his years of experience had prepared him for this moment, but not in the way he'd originally thought. The solution wouldn't come from confrontation or legal action. It would come from remembering what he'd learned in that church basement in 1947, that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is reach out to another soldier in pain. Early Saturday morning, before the bikers' usual arrival time, James asked Mike to help him set up a folding table in his driveway, right at the edge of his property near the empty lot. On the table, he carefully arranged his old military photos, his Purple Heart, and several medals from World War II. He added a large thermos of coffee, some paper cups, and his wife's old cookie jar filled with Margaret's special recipe chocolate chip cookies. Mike watched nervously as his grandfather settled into a chair behind the table. Are you sure about this, Grandpa? What if they react badly? James simply smiled, the same calm smile he'd worn when leading men into battle decades ago. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is extend your hand to someone who's hurt you, James said, arranging the photos carefully. One showed him in his dress uniform in 1945, another with his therapy group from 1947. The most prominent was a photo of him and his war buddies in front of a bombed-out building in France. At exactly 2 p.m., the familiar sound of Razor's motorcycle filled the air. James remained seated, calmly pouring himself a cup of coffee as the bike rounded the corner. Razor slowed down when he saw the display, his expression hidden behind his mirrored sunglasses. He parked his motorcycle and stood watching James for a long moment. What's this supposed to be, old man? Razor called out, trying to maintain his intimidating tone, but unable to hide his curiosity about the military medals on display. James took a sip of his coffee. Thought I'd share some war stories, he said casually. Coffee's fresh, and my wife's cookies were famous in 3 counties. Pull up a chair if you'd like. He gestured to an empty folding chair Mike had set up across from him. Razor hesitated, then walked closer, drawn by the familiar sight of military decorations, his eyes fixed on the Purple Heart. "You earned that?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "France, 1944, James replied, picking up the medal. "Same place I learned that the worst wounds aren't always the ones that bleed." He looked directly at Razor. "Vietnam was harder though, wasn't it? At least we came home to parades." Razor's head snapped up, his sunglasses coming off. "How did you?" "Research wasn't just for military intelligence," James said with a slight smile. "Sit down, Bobby. The cookies are still warm." He used Razor's real name deliberately, watching as the tough biker facade cracked slightly. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Razor sat down. James pushed a cup of coffee toward him and opened the cookie jar. "Tell me about your unit," he said quietly. "I saw you were with the 173rd Airborne Brigade." For a moment, Razor sat silently. Then, his hands wrapping around the warm coffee cup, he began to talk. He spoke of jungle warfare, of lost friends, of coming home to a country that didn't understand. As he talked, other bikers began arriving, hanging back uncertainly until James waved them over. "Grab some coffee," he called out. "Plenty of cookies, too." One by one, they joined the table, drawn by the familiar sight of military memorabilia and the sound of veterans sharing stories. James listened as they opened up about their own experiences: Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. Some spoke of fathers and uncles who'd served, of trying to understand their nightmares and silences. As the afternoon wore on, more chairs appeared. Mrs. Rodriguez brought out a plate of empanadas. Other neighbors, seeing the peaceful gathering, cautiously joined in. The bikers, their tough exteriors softening, shared stories of their own families, their struggles, their attempts to find purpose after service. "We started the club to help vets," Razor admitted, looking at his cookie thoughtfully. "Somewhere along the way, we forgot that part. Started pushing people around because it felt like the only power we had left." James nodded understanding. "After the war, I was angry too," he said, showing them a photo of himself from those difficult early days. "Started drinking, pushing everyone away. Then I found a group of vets who met in a church basement. They helped me remember who I was beyond the war." As the sun began to set, the gathering had transformed the empty lot. Where there had been tension and fear, now there was understanding. The tough bikers who had terrorized the neighborhood were revealed as wounded warriors, men who had lost their way but were finding it again through the wisdom of a fellow veteran who had walked the same difficult path decades before. Looking at his ruined rose garden, James had an idea. "You know," he said to Razor, "Margaret always said a garden needs strong hands to help it grow back stronger." 1 month after the coffee and cookies gathering, the neighborhood had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The empty lot, once a source of fear and tension, had been transformed. Where motorcycles had torn up the grass, there were now neat rows of vegetables and flowers. The bikers, under James's guidance, had turned it into a community garden. Razor, still wearing his leather vest but now often seen with gardening gloves in his back pocket, had taken a special interest in restoring Margaret's rose garden. His large, tattooed hands proved surprisingly gentle with the delicate plants. "My mother used to grow roses," he admitted to James one morning as they planted new bushes. "Never thought I'd find peace in a garden, but here we are." The garage behind James's house had become an unofficial veterans support center. Every Wednesday evening, bikes would line up neatly along the street as veterans from all eras gathered to share stories, challenges, and solutions. James would make coffee while Mrs. Rodriguez brought her famous empanadas. The meetings weren't formal therapy sessions, but healing happened there nevertheless. Young Tommy from next door was fascinated by the transformed bikers. Where once he had feared them, he now listened eagerly as they joined James in sharing carefully edited war stories. The veterans found themselves naturally mentoring neighborhood kids, teaching them about motorcycle maintenance, gardening, and the importance of respect and community. The change in the bikers themselves was remarkable. Their leather vests remained, but the aggressive posturing had disappeared. They still rode their motorcycles, but now they were careful to avoid revving engines late at night. Some had even started attending local veteran support services that James had helped them find, addressing the deeper wounds that had led to their previous behavior. One sunny Saturday, the neighborhood gathered for a special celebration. The community garden was in full bloom, with Margaret's roses creating a beautiful backdrop. James stood proudly, leaning on his cane, as Razor unveiled a small plaque they had installed. In honor of Margaret Henderson, it read, "Whose roses taught us that beauty can grow in unexpected places." The bikers had pooled their resources to create a proper memorial garden. Each rose bush had been carefully chosen to match the varieties Margaret had grown. They had even added benches where people could sit and enjoy the flowers. James felt tears in his eyes as he saw his wife's legacy living on in such an unexpected way. The transformation extended beyond the garden. Several of the younger bikers had found jobs through connections in the veteran community. Others had reunited with estranged family members, inspired by the peace they'd found in the garden and the support group. The motorcycle club still existed, but its mission had changed. They now organized rides to raise money for veteran causes and provided support for struggling former service members. Mrs. Rodriguez's grandchildren played freely in their yard again, often under the watchful eyes of the bikers who had become the neighborhood's unofficial guardians. The local police, once wary of the group, now stopped by the garden to chat and sample the vegetables the veterans grew. James's grandson Mike visited one evening and found his grandfather sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. The sound of quiet conversation and occasional laughter drifted from the garage where the weekly veterans meeting was wrapping up. In the garden, Razor and two other bikers were carefully tending to the roses, their motorcycles parked neatly along the street. "You know, Grandpa," Mike said, "when all this started, I thought you were planning some kind of military operation against them. I never expected this." James smiled, his eyes on the garden where former enemies had become family. "The best victories," he said softly, "are the ones where everyone wins. Your grandmother taught me that." He touched the small photo of Margaret he always kept in his pocket. She would have loved this garden and all these rough-looking boys taking care of her roses. As the sun set on another peaceful day, James reflected on how the situation had resolved itself, not through force or confrontation, but through understanding and compassion. The bikers had found the purpose and acceptance they'd been seeking since returning from war, and the neighborhood had gained a group of dedicated protectors and friends. In the end, it wasn't James's military strategy that had won the day. It was the lessons he'd learned from Margaret about patience, kindness, and the healing power of a garden. As he watched Razor carefully pruning a rose bush in the fading light, James knew that sometimes the greatest transformations come not from defeating an enemy, but from helping lost soldiers find their way home.